All right, so we are going to talk about Chapter 8, which is bad news messages. Not the most pleasant chapter, but they are realistic and happening in the business setting almost daily now. Think back to a time when you've heard bad news about business. It could be a company layoff, it could be a product being discontinued, but it is happening all the time. So it's important for you to know how to approach these and how to act in the business setting if you have to send a bad news message. This is one of the writing assignments that you will be assigned for this semester. So you'll be given a prompt and you just have to write a memo discussing your company not giving bonuses. We'll get to that later on. 4 objectives from the chapter that we're going to talk about are examples of bad news messages, planning a bad news message, replying to a bad news message, and announcing bad news. So just talking real quickly about examples of bad news. We just mentioned a few. So company layoffs, mergers and acquisitions. This can turn into bad news if it means that people will be laid off. You're not offering a bonus. You have to refuse a favor, or you have to reject an idea, or you have to announce a policy change and you know that it's going to upset people. So these are all different types of bad news messages that you talk about in the daily workplace. When going on to the second learning outcome now on slide 4, when you have to plan a bad news message, the worse the news in the message, the more planning you have to do. So the more planning that's needed. There are certain goals that you need to communicate in a bad news message. First, make your decision clear. By this, we mean that by the time your message is read or your message is heard from your audience, the decision should be clear. There shouldn't be any question really as to, so are you saying that I will lose my job or not lose my job? Help your audience accept the message, and that's by providing enough explanation and reasoning. Maintain a goodwill relationship. Remember that just because you're delivering bad news doesn't mean you're cutting off the relationships completely. So you want to make sure that you deliver it in such a way that there's tact involved, but that also the goodwill relationship is still there. Prevent further unnecessary discussion. And by this we mean that, again, if you present it in such a way, there really shouldn't be any unnecessary discussion. It should be clear, it should be simple. There really isn't any need for question or any follow-up or anything. Preserve the company's image. Remember that you are representative of your organization. So you want to make sure that you preserve your company's image so that there's nothing negative that comes back to you or the organization. And then protect the company against lawsuits. This is especially important if that is a written message, because whatever you say, if it's going to be documented, it's very permanent. And so whatever you put on paper, you want to make sure that it does not come back to bite you or do anything that could create a lawsuit. To plan a bad news message, first you need to assess the communication context. So this helps you determine how you're going to present the information. Is it going to be face-to-face, phone call, email, written? So by understanding the context of the message, helps you determine the presentation of it. Analyzing the audience, that helps you determine what information you're going to include. So is this going to be audience that already has pretty much all the background that they need, so you don't have to spend a lot of time giving background information? Or is this audience not expecting it? They're not really familiar with any of the context, thus you need to give them more information than you normally would. Choose the medium. So again, is this in person, email, face-to-face, Skype? How are you going to deliver this message? And then planning the components of the message. So just making sure that you look at all the different facets that go into it. Looking at the next slide, the communication model. Remember, this still takes place in communication settings. So there has to be some sort of communication need. So why do you need to deliver this bad news message? What is the need there? The sender, that would be you, the person sending the message itself. The audience, so how are they going to react? How do you expect them to react? What information do they need? And then any response if needed. So again, you want to prevent further unnecessary conversation. However, you do want to be open to questions. Ideally, you'd love everyone to just accept the bad news and understand the reasoning but you do want to make sure that you do provide some sort of platform if there's any questions allowed. So let's look at a couple of examples of bad news messages and see if you guys can figure out the medium that would be used. Canceling a contract with a longtime supplier. Would you deliver this bad news by email, letter, or a phone call? give you time to think about it. It'd probably be a phone call. Again, longtime supplier. This is a relationship. So you don't want to send them an email or send them a letter. You want to make sure you phone call. It's a little more personable, and it provides the two-way communication. What about firing a new employee who works across the country? That, again, is probably going to be a phone call as well. Sending an email, very impersonal, very not really professional. In-person visit across the country. By doing it as a phone call, or even if it was through email, it's still cost effective for the organization. This is a new employee. Now, if this was a tenured employee that's been there 10 to 15 years, that's where an in-person visit might be more effective. But if it's a new employee and they're being terminated, then it's probably okay to just do a phone call. So again, looking at the components and what to organize. What is the content of your message? So what exactly are you conveying? Is this complete, utter bad news that you are not offering bonuses after your company's offered them for 10 years? Are you discontinuing a product? While devastating, it's really not the end of the world. It's not huge news. Understanding how important the news is. Is it something that it's important, so you should probably give it its due diligence and call a staff meeting to deliver it in person so everyone's hearing the same message at the same time? Or is it something that's not so terribly important so that it can be, delivered to the managers and they can tell their employees as they see fit? What are the reader's expectations? So if this is a written message, how are you expecting your readers to reply to it? Again, we've talked about in the previous chapters that your reader will probably react the way you're expecting them to. So just keep that in mind. And then again, what is your relationship with the reader? You want to make sure that you convey the appropriate tone if it is somebody that works below you or somebody that works above you, or if it's a customer of yours. So keeping the relationship in mind is crucial. And then looking at a continuum approach. We've talked about direct and indirect organizational patterns. So when you look at the direct, it is putting the message right up front. If you're going more indirect, it's giving more explanation and detail, and then ultimately you would have the bad news delivered after the explanation and detail. When you're doing a bad news message, somewhere in the middle is best. You don't want to just come right out with the blow and say, this is not happening, and then provide explanation. So you kind of want to have it in the middle of the opening paragraph. How you would use the direct plan if you do decide to go that route is present a brief rationale along with the bad news. And again, I'm on slide 15 for making sure you're keeping up. So present a brief rationale along with the bad news. So small snippet of explanation, then the bad news itself. Follow up with explanations with that, and then end with a friendly closing. How would you use the indirect plan? Next slide. Would you, here are the 4 elements of a bad news message. Which one contains the 4 elements for the indirect plan? Is it bad news, apology, explanation, closing? Buffer, apology, bad news, explanation? Buffer, explanation, bad news, close? Or bad news, alternative, apology, close? Well, we know it's not A or D, and the reason we know that is because we're looking at an indirect organizational plan. And remember, the indirect plan shows that the bad news is not right up front. You're going to have some sort of explanation beforehand, right? So that leaves us with options B and C. The reason B is not an option is because in a bad news message, you never apologize. That is one of the things. And if you lose all credibility the minute you start apologizing, the minute you start saying, oh, I'm really sorry, the company policy makes me do this. No, that is unprofessional, and it's not the way that you convey a bad news message. So your best answer for that is C, buffer, explanation, bad news, close. And a buffer is just simply a neutral opening statement designed to lessen the impact. So you're not going to come right out and just drop the bomb like, hey, by the way, you're going to lose your job today. But there is some sort of buffer there that doesn't make the blow as hard to take. What do you think about the goal of a buffer statement in a bad news message? Looking at slide 18. Is it to establish or strengthen the reader-writer relationship? To apologize for the bad news? Well, we know that's not an option because you don't apologize. Is it to summarize the bad news or to hint at the bad news? And your best answer for this is going to be A, to establish or strengthen the reader-writer relationship. Remember, this isn't a game. It's a bad news message. No one likes receiving it. No one likes delivering it. So you're not going to hint at bad news, right? You're not going to dangle it in front of them. Again, it's going to be clear-cut so that there really isn't any question, and people that are receiving the bad news understand where it's coming from, why the decision was made, and ultimately what the outcome is. And looking at the next slide, and you can make your buffer any type of buffer you want. It could be neutral, relevant, supportive, interesting, and short. So choosing what components from your buffer statement you're going to include are key. Next, you need to justify your decision, and this is on slide 20. So state reasons using positive language. So again, making sure that you talk about the, ultimately why it came to this, if there's any good that can come from this. Explain the rationale for the company policy. Don't just say company policy, sorry, there's nothing I can do. But talk about why the company policy is the way it is and why it ultimately had to come to this, or this decision had to get made. State reasons concisely. Do not over-explain. When you over-explain, it looks like you're just trying too hard. So make sure that your reasons are concise, and then present your strongest reasons first. If you can, explain how the reasons benefit the reader or the person that's receiving the message. And then ultimately you have to give the bad news, right? So you've done all this planning, you've done all this work into putting the bad news together. Present the bad news as a logical outcome. Again, you've presented the reasonings so far in a way that it really kind of makes sense that this is a logical outcome. This is the reason that the decision was made. State the bad news in positive and impersonal language. So you want to avoid you or your. Do not apologize unless you are at fault. So I should make that a stipulation. If you're at fault, then you can apologize. Otherwise, there's no reason for you to apologize in the bad news message. And make the refusal definite. So if you're rejecting an idea or rejecting a favor or a customer request, make sure that it is definite. So don't waver on it. Don't make it sound like there's, an opportunity for change later in the future if there really isn't. And then finally, you've delivered the bad news. Close on a positive tone. So you want to avoid apologizing. Again, can't state that enough. Avoid anticipating problems. If you anticipate there are going to be problems or backlash, then you're going to have problems or backlash. Don't invite needless communication. Don't repeat the bad news. Once is enough. So once you say it, they'll get the idea, but don't keep stating it over and over again. Don't use cliches. Don't sound selfish, and don't reveal any doubt. However, techniques you should use, offer best wishes. Make sure there is sincerity in your tone. Remember, your tone has to be, business professional, not too emotional, but make sure that it's sincere and genuine. Suggest a counter proposal. That could be helpful if appropriate. Direct to other sources. And then, if at all possible, refer to sales promotions. So again, if you're talking about rejecting an idea, you can maybe throw in a sale or talk about something your company is going to be doing later on in the future. So that's planning bad news messages. Let's talk about replying to bad news messages. First, the book talks about rejecting an idea. So think about a time when you presented an idea that was not accepted. How did the person respond, and how did you feel? So we've all had some sort of business setting, right, where we've had an idea or we've had something that, hey, I wonder if maybe this would work if we tried it this way. And you might have heard the reason that, oh, we've already tried that before, it didn't work. Or why would we do it? We've always done it this way, and this has always worked for us, so we don't need to change anything. If it's not broke, don't fix it. It kind of makes you feel crummy, right? You have this idea, you think it might work, but no one even wants to give you the time to try and implement it or do a test pilot to see if it would work. So if you're on the receiving end of someone coming to you with an idea, the best way to approach it is explain your decision, but don't discourage anyone from submitting any more ideas in the future. Just because this idea might not be appropriate at the right time, maybe in 6 months it would, maybe next year, or maybe next quarter. But make sure you keep the line of communication open so people feel comfortable coming to you if they have another idea. If you are going to refuse a customer request, use the indirect plan if the reader is emotionally involved. Again, a buffer statement is necessary. Use impersonal neutral language to explain the reasons, so making sure that you have a respectful tone, and then offer a small compromise to help retain the customer's goodwill. Remember, it's a customer relationship. It's still the business world, so you still want to keep that customer, because if they have a bad experience, then ultimately they're going to go to Facebook, they're going to go to social media, they're going to tell their friends and family not to shop at your company, and then you've lost a customer, but you've also lost a circle of potential customers as well. And then lastly, announcing bad news messages. And so the next slide, slide 27, looks at bad news about normal operations. And so these are different tweets from organizations and how they would announce bad news about operations. So the first one is looking at the Harrisburg Airport, I cannot talk, and talking about flights that are canceled and maybe flights that are on time. And then they provide a link for you to check the status. So if you are following this particular person or particular airport on Twitter, then it's helpful that you can get information that way. Unitil, which is an energy company, tweeted about how a thunderstorm knocked out power to 3,000 in the Concord area because of a tree on the line. So there's nothing dramatic, there's nothing, not inviting further conversation, but it's simply just relaying messages. And then Vineyard Vines, they are replying back to somebody who asked them about a product, saying that they do. The ties and totes are out of stock online right now, but they should be back closer to school time. So they're just simply saying that a particular item that this customer is looking for is not in stock. If you're talking about bad news about the organization, make sure that you have the bad news come from you. You don't want it to come from blogs, newspapers, or media. So if there's something about your organization, you need to be the person to convey it. If you have a PR department in your organization, you want to make sure that they maybe release a news release, but make sure that your employees know first. Again, choose your words carefully because you cannot control how your message is interpreted. If the reader is already aware of the news and they just need it to formally, so think about the situations where you hear that they kind of saw it coming, but it had to be a formal announcement. That's where you can use the direct organizational plan so that you would just come right out and, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We are closing 3 branches by this time next year, but something along those lines. And then last one is bad news about jobs. So if you are conveying bad news about jobs, maintain the employees' goodwill is crucial. So making sure that your employees still feel like they've been respected and that the message was conveyed professionally. If you don't do that, then the likelihood of your employees going to gossip columns or just bad-mouthing your company to other people, word of mouth is the worst press ever if it's negative. So making sure that it's handled in a professional and business professional setting is crucial for your company. So that is chapter 8, very simple bad news messages. We will discuss later on the assignment that comes with writing a bad news message. If you have any questions from anything you heard in the lecture tonight, then please let me know, send me an email, or ask me in class. See you guys soon. Bye.